The wind on the Siberian tundra does not ask your age. It does not care if you are 15. It does not care if you're holding the hand of a 7-year-old boy who has nowhere else to go. On a late August morning in 1886, a sledge rolled away from a half-collapsed claim 12 miles south of a remote settlement near Yakutsk, Siberia. Snow dust rose behind it. Then the dust settled, and just like that, Anya Petrovna was alone. She stood in waist-high frozen grass and sparse taiga scrub, a thin girl with wind-chapped cheeks and tired eyes that had already seen too much of the world. Beside her stood her little brother, Ivan, 7 years old. Quiet, always quiet. At her feet lay everything they owned, a blanket, a cookpot, 43 kopecks sewn into a cloth purse. Behind her stood the wreck of someone else's failure. A Zemlyanka dug into a low rise. 3 walls of packed earth, a roof that had caved in, a door hanging from one leather hinge like a broken promise. The man who had left them there had said it plain. You won't last a month. The tundra swallowed the sound of his sledge runners. If you have ever wondered how far a human being can be pushed before they break, stay with this story, because what that girl did next should not have worked. And yet it did. Anya walked toward the Zemlyanka slowly. The air smelled dry like frost and old pine needles. Inside, the earth walls held a faint coolness. In one corner sat a cast-iron stove, too heavy for whoever left the hallway. 3 rusted lengths of stovepipe leaned against the wall. A broken chair lay on its side, scratched into the wood by some desperate hand with the words, God, help whoever comes next. Ivan stepped close to her. Anya, what do we do? She did not answer because she did not know. Winter on the Siberian plains did not arrive gently. It came like a hammer. Snow in October, ice by November, wind that screamed across the open land with nothing to stop it. A proper izba required thousands of logs. Each log weighed as much as a sack of grain. A grown man needed weeks to build one. Anya was 15. She had no team of reindeer, no tools except what she could borrow, no timber within miles, no money worth naming, and no one willing to bet on her survival. 3 miles east lived an older Evenki herder named Nikolai Ivanov. He had buried children in Siberian soil. He had survived 6 winters. When he rode up days later and saw the broken Zemlyanka, he did not soften his words. A girl alone with a child, he said, studying her. You will freeze, and that boy will freeze with you. It was certain. He offered her work in his household. Food, shelter, safety. All she had to do was give up the claim, give up the land, give up the chance to stand on her own. Anya looked at Ivan, who was stacking dry moss and twigs near the frozen stream, trying to be useful. I'll file the claim, she said quietly. I'll build. Nikolai shook his head. Winter does not care about courage. He rode away, already sure of the ending. That night the wind rose. It pushed through the broken Zemlyanka roof and carried the dry rattle of scrub branches, shifting along the fence line. That sound kept her awake. She lay beside Ivan, listening to the scrape of thorn against thorn over and over, a restless whisper in the dark. The next morning she walked a quarter section. The well was dry, the old garden choked with frost-killed weeds. The beginnings of sod house crumbled back into the ground, and along the eastern fence line, piled higher than her head, lay drifts of tumbleweeds, Russian thistle, brown, tangled, worthless. Every herder cursed them. They clogged fences, choked wells, spread like plague. Anya pulled one free. It was light, almost weightless. But when she pressed her hand into its center, she felt something strange. Still air. The wind could not reach inside the tangled branches. She pushed deeper. The air there did not move. An air that does not move does not carry heat away. She stood very still. The idea did not come all at once. It came like a spark. Slow, dangerous, impossible. What if walls did not need to be heavy? What if they only needed to trap air? That afternoon, she walked 3 miles to the Ivanov camp and asked to borrow a spade. Nikolai's wife looked at her blistered hands. What are you digging for? I'm lowering the floor. Anya said, if we live below ground level, it will stay warmer. The older woman studied her for a long time. Then she handed her the spade. Anya returned home and began digging. The earth was hard as iron. Every scoop took effort. Ivan carried dirt away in the cookpot. By sunset, her palms were bleeding. By the third day, the floor sat nearly 2 foot lower. Down there, the air felt different, cooler in the heat of day, less touched by the wind. She stood in the pit she had made and looked toward the fence line at the tumbleweeds. Thousands of them, free. By the end of the week, she had decided if she could not build with timber, she would build with weeds. If she could not afford logs, she would use air. She would bend green willow poles into a dome. She would wrap them in wire, and she would pack tumbleweeds between the layers so tight that no wind could pass. A house made from the most useless plant on the tundra. It sounded foolish. It sounded dangerous. It sounded like something only a desperate child would attempt. But winter was coming, and desperation is sometimes the mother of invention. As September cooled and the first frost silvered the grass at dawn, Anya Petrova began building a dome from weeds and wire. The neighbors shook their heads. The older men predicted fire. The older women predicted burial. But every night, as she packed the thorny branches tighter and tighter, the walls grew thicker, darker still, and inside that rising shell of tangled weeds, the air no longer moved. Winter had not yet arrived, but it was watching, and soon the real test would come. By early October, the dome no longer looked like a pile of weeds. It looked like defiance. The willow poles bent inward and met at the top like clasped hands. 2 layers of wire held the shape firm. Between them, Anya had packed tumbleweeds so tight her fingers bled through strips of torn blanket. From a distance, it resembled a rough haystack. Up close, it felt solid. When you stepped inside, something changed. The wind disappeared. The sound of the tundra softened, and the air stayed still. The first night she sealed the entrance with a hanging blanket and lit the old cast-iron stove. She held her breath. Ivan sat cross-legged on the packed earth floor, watching the stovepipe with wide eyes. Outside, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. Inside, the fire caught slowly. Twisted dry moss, dried reindeer dung, a handful of brittle larch twigs. The flames climbed. Smoke rose through the pipe. Anya pressed her palm against the tumbleweed wall. She waited for heat, waited for flame, waited for everything to go wrong. Nothing burned. The compressed weeds did not ignite. They only warmed. The heat met the packed air and stayed there. Within an hour, Ivan removed his coat. Within 2, she had to crack the entrance blanket to let in cooler air. It was working. She did not smile. She did not celebrate because she understood something most grown men ignored. Surviving one cold night is not the same as surviving a winter. By mid-October, frost covered the tundra each morning. The grass snapped underfoot. The sky felt higher and harder. Anya counted her fuel. 50 bushels of dried dung and twisted moss. Enough for maybe 12 days of steady fire. Winter in Siberia lasted 7 months. She began rationing. 1 hour of fire in the morning, 1 hour at night. The rest of the day, they relied on the dome itself. The dead air trapped inside the thorny walls held what warmth their bodies made. At night, they slept in all their clothes, breath fogged in the dim light. Water formed a thin sheet of ice in the bucket by morning, but they did not freeze. The neighbors noticed. Nikolai Ivanov came again. He stepped inside and stood very still. Outside, it was -8 degrees. Inside, with no fire burning. It held just above freezing. He pressed his thick hand against the wall. "It's warm," he said quietly. Not warm like an izba with logs and coal, but warm enough to live. He did not apologize. He only nodded once before leaving. That small nod meant more than praise. But November was patient. On the 22nd, the temperature fell below 0 for the first time. The wind returned with it. Not steady wind, violent wind. It clawed at the dome like a living thing. Inside, the willow poles creaked. The wire strained. Ivan woke in the dark. "Anya, will it break?" She wrapped her arm around him. "No," she said. She hoped her voice sounded stronger than she felt. The dome flexed. It did not collapse. Snow began to pile against the eastern side, adding weight, but also adding insulation. Nature, in its cruelty, offered help. The real trouble came quietly. Just before Christmas, Ivan started coughing. At first, it was small, dry, then deeper. His skin burned while the air around them froze. Anya fed the stove constantly now. Fuel disappeared faster than she could replace it. She boiled Snow for water. She held him against her chest to share warmth. There was no doctor within 60 miles. No sledge, no reindeer. Only a 15-year-old girl in a house made of weeds, listening to her brother struggle to breathe. If you have ever sat beside someone you love and felt completely helpless, you understand the weight that settled on her shoulders that night. She did not cry. She talked instead. She told him stories of St. Petersburg, of crowded streets and warm kitchens, of things she barely remembered but hoped he did. For 3 days, she did not sleep. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the dome held at 32 degrees. Cold, but not killing. On the morning of December 28th, Ivan opened his eyes. "I'm hungry," he whispered. It was the sweetest sound she had ever heard. She fed him the last spoon of honey in their possession. He ate slowly, and the fever broke. The dome had held. But winter was not finished. January arrived like judgment. The temperature fell to minus 26 degrees, the kind of cold that changes the sound of your breath. The tumbleweed walls shrank slightly in the deep freeze. Mud seals cracked. Ice formed along the inner surface where breath met frozen air. Anya burned everything she could. Moss from a neighbor, the broken chair, the last bundles of twisted grass. The pile shrank to 3 bushels. Until one morning, she opened the stove door and realized there was nothing left. Nothing but the walls themselves. She could burn the tumbleweeds for a few hours of heat, and then they would die when the fire went out. She closed the stove for 3 days. They survived without flame. Body heat. Sealed entrance, breathing slowly under every scrap of cloth they owned. The temperature inside dropped to 18 degrees. Their water froze solid. Frost formed on their blankets. Ivan shivered against her, but he did not complain. She whispered one thing over and over in the darkness. "We are not done yet." That is the moment most people give up. Not in the first storm, not in the first failure, but when the numbers say there is no path forward, when pride and survival collide, when help feels like weakness. On the evening of January 10th, just as her strength began to thin, there was scratching at the entrance. Through a blizzard no one should have been able to walk through, Maria Kuznetsova appeared with a sled of moss and dried dung. She pushed inside, took one look at the frost-coated walls and the empty stove, and shook her head. "You stubborn child," she muttered. She lit the fire herself, fed it boiled water, forced Anya to drink. "You nearly died," Maria said. Anya nodded, but she was still here. And outside, the wind was building again, stronger than before. The storm that would be remembered for decades was already forming on the horizon. And this time, the dome would face something far worse than hunger. It would face the kind of cold that kills grown men in minutes. The real test had not yet begun. It was coming fast. On the morning of January 12, 1887, the air felt wrong, too still, too mild. The temperature had risen above freezing overnight. Snow softened. Drips fell from the edge of the dome. Ivan even stepped outside without his coat, laughing at the sudden warmth. Anya did not laugh. She had lived on the tundra long enough to understand something simple. January mercy never lasts. By noon, the sky to the northwest darkened into a hard white wall. Not gray, not blue, white. The kind of white that erases the horizon. She felt the drop before she saw it. The wind shifted. The warmth vanished. The air turned sharp, then cruel. Within 1 hour, the temperature fell more than 20 degrees. Within 2, it was below 0. She sealed the entrance, packed moss into every crack, checked the stovepipe collar twice. Ivan sat quietly, watching her hands move fast. By mid-afternoon, the blizzard struck, not like wind, like force. The dome shook. The willow ribs groaned under pressure. Snow slammed against the walls, so hard it sounded like thrown gravel. Ivan buried his face in her coat. "It will hold," she told him. She did not know if that was true. The temperature inside began to fall. 40 degrees, 35 degrees, 28 degrees. She fed the stove steadily, burning moss as fast as she dared. Flames roared. Heat pushed outward. The tumbleweed walls trapped it. But outside, the storm screamed. The sound was not wind anymore. It was a shriek like the sky itself tearing open. By nightfall, the interior temperature hovered at 22 degrees, cold enough to sting the lungs, cold enough to freeze water solid, but not killing. Not yet. Then came the scratching at the entrance. At first, she thought it was snow piling against the blanket. Then she heard a voice, faint, broken by wind. She pulled the blanket aside and dragged the body inside. Sofia Ivanova, her coat torn, her face white with frost, fingers stiff and pale. "Nikolai," she gasped. He went out to the reindeer. He didn't come back. She had walked 3 miles in a killing storm. Alone, Anya wrapped her in blankets and pushed her close to the stove. Frostbitten fingers began to burn as feeling returned. Ivan stared wide-eyed at the frozen woman who had once fed him warm bread. Outside, the storm did not ease. Inside, the dome flexed but did not break. The fire burned through nearly all remaining moss that night. The temperature inside fell to 19 degrees before dawn. But they were alive. At first light, the wind weakened. Anya dug through 4 feet of drifted snow to reach open air. The world was gone. Fence posts buried. Windmills swallowed. Nothing but endless white under a pale sky. Search parties formed 2 days later. They found Nikolai Ivanov 200 feet from his corral. He had survived 6 Siberian winters. The 7th took him. 11 people died in that storm. Families in proper izbas, men with teams of reindeer, children wrapped in furs beside strong log walls. Inside a dome built from weeds and wire, 2 children and 1 grieving widow survived. When Maria Kuznetsova arrived with supplies and tears freezing on her cheeks, she stepped inside and stood very still. "It held," she whispered. Yes, it held. The interior had dropped to 16 degrees at its coldest point. Bitter, uncomfortable, but not lethal. The tumbleweed walls packed tight enough to trap. Still air had slowed the cold just enough. Just enough. And sometimes in survival, just enough is the difference between a grave and a sunrise. News spread when the trails cleared. Men came to look. Women stepped inside and pressed their palms against the thorn-packed walls the way Nikolai once had. "It's warm," they said. It shouldn't be warm. But it was. Anya did not boast. She did not charge. She showed them everything. How she lowered the floor below ground level. How she bent willow poles into a dome. How she layered wire and packweeds tighter than seemed possible. How she sealed every crack. Because still air is stronger than wood when it is protected. Some tried it. Some failed because they rushed the packing or left gaps, but others succeeded. Fuel use dropped. Reindeer shelters survived deeper cold. Additions were built against north walls. A pest plant became insulation. A nuisance became shelter. The man who abandoned them never spoke to her again. He rode past once, saw the crowd gathered around the strange dome, and kept going. He had predicted burial. Instead, he saw proof. Anya proved up her claim in record time. Years later, she built a proper log house on that same quarter section. Straight boards, real windows, a roof that did not bend in storms. But she never tore down the dome. She kept it standing behind the new house. Visitors came to see it. Children ran their hands across the old tumbleweed walls long after thorns had softened with time. When she married, when Ivan left for school, when seasons came and went, that dome remained a quiet witness. Not innovation, not a rebellion, but to refusal. Refusal to surrender when every voice said surrender. Refusal to believe that lack of money meant lack of possibility. Refusal to let winter write the ending. Anya Petrova lived to 61. She was buried in the small cemetery near Yakutsk beside her husband. Her headstone was simple. Name, dates, nothing about weeds, nothing about blizzards. But the people of the region remembered. They remembered the storm of 1887. They remembered the men who froze. And they remembered the 15-year-old girl who had 43 kopecks, a 7-year-old brother, and a pile of worthless tumbleweeds. On the morning after that terrible storm, she stood in pale January light and watched her breath rise into clear air. Behind her, the dome stood battered but unbroken. Inside, her brother slept, alive. That was her answer to every doubt. Not anger, not argument, not pride. She was alive. And sometimes the strongest wisdom the frontier ever teaches is this. You do not need perfect conditions. You do not need perfect tools. You need courage, clear thinking, and the stubborn refusal to give up when the numbers say you should.